I watched the arrest of Nicolás Maduro unfold not as an intelligence success, but as a familiar Washington ritual, an operational moment instantly repackaged into a story designed for domestic consumption. Within hours, the facts stopped mattering. What replaced them was a victory narrative so inflated that it obscured the very conditions that made the operation possible and the risks it created afterward. I've spent enough years inside the intelligence system to recognize when analysis is being replaced by performance. This was one of those moments. Maduro's detention was real, but the meaning assigned to it was largely fictional. Public messaging framed the event as the collapse of a regime, the severing of hostile alliances, and the restoration of hemispheric order. Those claims moved faster than any verified intelligence assessment. The problem wasn't optimism, it was the absence of restraint. Intelligence professionals are trained to distinguish tactical success from strategic resolution. That distinction vanished almost immediately. Statements from senior officials and media surrogates portrayed the arrest as decisive, ignoring decades of reporting that showed Venezuela as a deeply networked system of military elites, criminal organizations, and foreign patrons that could not be dismantled by removing one man. What troubled me most was how quickly intelligence failures were hidden behind rhetorical certainty. There was no serious public discussion of succession dynamics, internal security fragmentation, or the likelihood that interim authorities would inherit the same coercive dependencies. Instead, the arrest was framed as a liberation event, a symbolic rupture that supposedly reset the regional balance of power. That framing wasn't supported by classified or open source intelligence. It was supported by polling needs and ideological comfort. This is how strategic narratives collapse, not all at once, but through repeated substitution of story for structure. When intelligence is used to validate a political script rather than challenge it, decision makers lose their ability to anticipate second and third order effects. In this case, the immediate consequence was a surge of regional signaling warnings to Colombia, insinuations toward Cuba, exaggerated claims about narco-terror networks that expanded the crisis footprint without a coherent containment plan. The hard lesson is simple and unforgiving. An arrest is not an outcome, it is an inflection point. When intelligence professionals allow themselves to become narrators instead of analysts, the state begins to mistake motion for progress. That is how credibility erodes not through defeat, but through self-inflicted illusion. I learned early in my career that intelligence exists to disappoint power, not flatter it. Its job is to tell policymakers what they don't want to hear, especially in moments of apparent success. After Maduro's arrest, that discipline collapsed almost immediately. What should have been a sober assessment phase, evaluating stability, command cohesion, foreign reactions, and internal security risks, was overwhelmed by optics. Television studios, press briefings, and carefully crafted sound bites replaced intelligence estimates as the primary drivers of perception. Inside the system, I've seen how this happens. Analysts are asked not what is likely to occur, but how developments can be framed. Language shifts subtly but decisively. What are the risks? Becomes, how do we message the risks? Intelligence stops being a warning system and becomes a support function for public relations. In the case of Venezuela, this meant that unresolved intelligence questions were treated as inconveniences. The cohesion of the armed forces, the loyalties of regional commanders, the endurance of cartel-linked financing networks. None of these lent themselves to clean visuals or triumphant headlines, so they were pushed aside. The distortion was compounded by selective disclosure. Officials spoke confidently about dismantling hostile foreign influence, yet open-source reporting and years of declassified material showed that Russian, Iranian, and Chinese engagement in Venezuela was not centralized around Maduro personally. It was institutional, commercial, and security-based. Removing a figurehead does not dissolve contracts, intelligence sharing arrangements, or embedded advisory relationships. Intelligence officers knew this. Many had written it. But those assessments were not what reached the public. Strategically, the consequence of privileging optics over intelligence was immediate escalation without preparation. Statements directed at Colombia, Mexico, and Cuba expanded the narrative battlefield, while operational planning lagged behind rhetoric. In intelligence terms, this is classic overextension driven by narrative momentum. When leaders believe their own messaging, they assume adversaries and partners will internalize it the same way. They rarely do. Regional actors interpret U.S. declarations not as facts, but as signals, and signals without credible follow through create instability. The analytical breakdown is blunt. Intelligence failed not because information was missing, but because it was ignored. The system rewarded certainty over accuracy and speed over verification. Once that pattern sets in, corrective analysis becomes politically dangerous. No one wants to be the analyst who says the victory is incomplete, the risks unresolved, the future uncertain. The hard lesson here is one, intelligence officers relearn too often. Optics age quickly. Reality does not. When intelligence is subordinated to image management, policy loses its anchor. What follows is not strategic dominance, but a widening gap between what Washington says and what the world observes. From an intelligence perspective, the most predictable outcome of the post-arrest narrative was regional blowback. It wasn't chaos, but it was instability, measured, reactive, and entirely foreseeable. The problem was never Venezuela in isolation. Anyone who had worked Latin America desks over the past 3 decades understood that Venezuela functioned as a node, not a standalone problem. When Washington spoke as if Maduro's removal reset the hemisphere, it revealed a profound misreading of how power actually circulates in the region. Colombia was the first pressure point, and not by accident. Long before Maduro's arrest, intelligence reporting documented the porous overlap between Colombian armed groups, Venezuelan safe havens, and transnational narcotics routes. Those networks did not disappear when Maduro was detained. They recalibrated. Public threats and rhetorical warnings aimed at Bogota ignored a basic intelligence reality. Colombian leaders operate within a constrained domestic environment shaped by insurgent remnants, cartel economics, and fragile political coalitions. When U.S. officials signaled coercion without coordination, they injected uncertainty into an already volatile system. Intelligence analysts knew this would harden nationalist resistance rather than produce compliance. Mexico presented a different but equally predictable reaction. Years of reporting have shown that Mexican cartels are not merely criminal organizations, they are political actors with territorial control and institutional penetration. Framing the Venezuela operation as a template for hemispheric enforcement sent an unintended signal. It suggested escalation without addressing the structural limits of state power in Mexico. That kind of signaling doesn't deter cartels. It incentivizes them to entrench, diversify routes, and deepen corruption networks. Intelligence warnings about this dynamic were neither new nor controversial. They were simply inconvenient. Cuba's role was even more mischaracterized. Havana was treated rhetorically as a dependent extension of the Venezuelan system, when in reality it has survived decades of external pressure through adaptation and intelligence discipline. The assumption that Venezuela's disruption would automatically cascade into Cuban collapse reflected narrative thinking, not intelligence analysis. Cuban security services have long planned for external shocks. Treating them as passive beneficiaries rather than active planners revealed how far strategic assessment had drifted. The analytical breakdown is clear. Washington mapped the region as a collection of dominoes rather than interconnected systems. That is not how intelligence understands causality. Each country reacted not to the arrest itself, but to the implications embedded in U.S. messaging. When signals outpace strategy, partners hedge, adversaries probe, and neutral actors distance themselves. The hard lesson is uncomfortable but unavoidable. Regional credibility is not established through declarations. It is earned through consistency, coordination, and respect for complexity. By ignoring its own intelligence, Washington transformed a contained operation into a dispersed credibility test, one it was never prepared to pass. One of the most enduring fictions in U.S. foreign policy is the idea that criminal networks operate on the margins of political power. Intelligence reporting has contradicted that belief for decades, Yet policymakers continue to behave as if cartels are external threats rather than embedded systems. The aftermath of Maduro's arrest exposed this illusion in stark terms. Public statements spoke of cracking down on narcotics flows as if that were a discrete task, separate from governance. Anyone who has read the files knows better. In Venezuela, the fusion between state authority and organized crime was not a late-stage corruption problem. It was a structural feature. Military units, customs officials, energy managers, and political figures were tied into revenue streams that sustained loyalty and control. Removing the figure at the top did not sever those links. It redistributed them. Intelligence assessments had long warned that interim leadership would inherit the same dependencies, facing pressure not only from foreign actors, but from domestic networks that had no interest in transparency or reform. This pattern was not unique to Venezuela. Colombia, Mexico, and parts of Central America have operated under variations of the same model for years. Cartels evolve into hybrid entities, part criminal, part political, part social authority. They provide employment, security, and enforcement where the state cannot or will not. When U.S. officials framed the post-arrest phase as an opportunity to clean house, they ignored the intelligence reality that dismantling such systems requires generational transformation, not rapid coercion. The strategic consequence of this misreading was overconfidence. By treating cartel influence as something that could be pressured out of existence through demands and warnings, Washington set itself up for disappointment and escalation. Intelligence officers understood that aggressive public timelines talk of rapid stabilization or swift elections would collide with entrenched interests capable of violence and sabotage. That collision was not hypothetical. It was historically documented. The analytical breakdown here is rooted in institutional denial. Acknowledging cartel state fusion forces policymakers to confront limits. It means admitting that allies are compromised, that leverage is partial, and that outcomes are uncertain. Narrative-driven policy cannot tolerate that level of ambiguity. So the intelligence is softened, caveated into irrelevance, or excluded altogether. The hard lesson is, one, intelligence professionals repeat quietly and politicians resist loudly. You cannot separate crime from politics in systems where survival depends on their integration. Pretending otherwise doesn't weaken criminal power, it blinds policy to reality. When intelligence is ignored in favor of moral clarity, the result is neither justice nor stability, but prolonged disorder disguised as progress. Another pillar of the post-arrest narrative was the claim that Maduro's detention struck a decisive blow against Russia, China, and Iran. From an intelligence standpoint, that assertion never held up. It reflected a shallow reading of great power behavior, one that confuses symbolism with leverage. I spent years tracking how major powers hedge risk, diversify access, and insulate their interests from leadership volatility. None of those states anchored their Venezuela strategies to Maduro as an individual. They anchored them to institutions, contracts, and long-term positioning. Russia's involvement was routinely overstated in public rhetoric and misunderstood in substance. Moscow's objectives in Venezuela were transactional and opportunistic arms sales, energy stakes, limited intelligence, cooperation, not ideological dependency. Russian planners assume regime churn. They design for it. The arrest of one leader does not erase loan agreements, maintenance contracts, or security relationships cultivated over years. Intelligence reporting had documented this repeatedly, yet public messaging suggested a strategic setback for Moscow that intelligence professionals knew was, at best, marginal. China's position was even more misread. Beijing's engagement was financial and infrastructural, focused on debt leverage, resource access, and political non-interference. Chinese policy does not require stable democracies or charismatic partners. It requires enforceable obligations. Whether Maduro remained free or detained was secondary to whether successor authorities honored existing commitments. From an intelligence perspective, China's risk exposure was already priced in. Treating the arrest as a blow to Beijing's influence betrayed a misunderstanding of how Chinese state capitalism manages uncertainty Iran was perhaps the most rhetorically inflated factor. References to Tehran served domestic narrative needs more than analytical accuracy. Iranian activity in Venezuela was limited, pragmatic, and constrained by geography and logistics. Intelligence assessments consistently ranked it as a secondary concern, yet public statements elevated it to justify broader claims of strategic victory. This is a classic intelligence distortion. Amplify a manageable threat to give an operation global significance. The strategic consequence of these misreadings was complacency. By declaring great power influence weakened, Washington reduced its own incentive to monitor adaptation. In reality, Russia, China, and Iran adjusted quietly, engaging new interlocutors, protecting assets, and waiting out the noise. Intelligence should have warned that overstatement invites countermeasures, not retreat. The analytical breakdown is simple. Great powers do not abandon interests because Washington declares success. They reassess, recalibrate, and exploit overconfidence. When intelligence analysis is subordinated to narrative triumph, policymakers lose sight of adversary learning curves. The hard lesson is one intelligence veterans recognize instinctively: strategic competition is not won through press releases, it is managed through patience, realism, and accurate threat assessment. When the United States mistakes narrative disruption for strategic gain, it reveals more about its own analytical decay than about any adversary's weakness. By the time Maduro's arrest had been absorbed into the official storyline, the deeper damage was already underway inside the U.S. national security system itself. This is the part outsiders rarely see, but intelligence professionals recognize immediately. Institutions adapt not to reality, but to incentives. When political leadership rewards affirmation over accuracy, intelligence organizations learn to survive by anticipation rather than analysis. That is how self-deception becomes systemic. I watched this pattern emerge long before Venezuela. Analysts stop asking whether an assumption is wrong and start asking whether challenging it is worth the cost. Dissenting assessments are softened, delayed, or buried under layers of caveats. Language becomes deliberately vague. Probabilities are blurred into possibilities. In the case of Venezuela, hard questions about succession, fragility, military factionalism, and criminal entrenchment were framed as longer-term considerations safely removed from immediate decision cycles. That is not intelligence failure in the classic sense. It is institutional adaptation to political pressure. The post-arrest environment accelerated this process. Once senior officials publicly committed to a victory narrative, contradictory intelligence became a liability. Agencies were expected to validate outcomes already declared. This reverses the proper flow of decision-making. Instead of policy responding to intelligence, intelligence is retrofitted to policy. Over time, this produces analysts who are technically competent but strategically irrelevant. They learn how to write around problems rather than confront them. The strategic consequence is erosion of internal credibility. Policymakers stop trusting intelligence not because it is wrong, but because it no longer surprises them. When intelligence ceases to challenge assumptions, it becomes redundant. Leaders turn to media, think tanks, and ideological advisors for confirmation, further marginalizing professional analysis. The system enters a feedback loop where belief substitutes for evidence. The analytical breakdown is uncomfortable because it implicates everyone. Politicians prefer certainty. Intelligence managers prefer institutional survival. Analysts prefer career stability. Together, they create an environment where fiction is not imposed from above, but quietly co-authored. No single memo causes the collapse. It happens through omission, silence, and rewarded conformity. The hard lesson is one I learned painfully. Intelligence institutions do not collapse when they are wrong. They collapse when they stop trying to be right. Once an organization internalizes the idea that its role is to support narratives rather than test them, recovery becomes extraordinarily difficult. At that point, strategic failure is not an accident. It is an outcome baked into the system. The final cost of turning intelligence into fiction is not measured in headlines or approval ratings. It is measured in credibility. And once lost, credibility does not return on command. By the time the narrative around Maduro's arrest had fully crystallized, the gap between what Washington claimed and what the world observed was already widening. Allies noticed it first. Adversaries exploited it next. Intelligence professionals understood it immediately. Credibility in foreign policy is not about being feared or admired. It is about being believed. When U.S. officials declared that Venezuela had been liberated, regional actors compared that claim to their own intelligence, economic realities, and security conditions. What they saw was continuity disguised as rupture. Interim authorities constrained by the same power brokers, criminal networks intact, foreign partners adapting quietly. The mismatch between rhetoric and reality signaled something more damaging than miscalculation. It signaled unreliability. The strategic consequence was subtle but enduring. Partners began to hedge, cooperation became transactional and conditional. Public alignment masked private skepticism. Intelligence sharing slowed or became selective. This is how influence decays not through open defiance, but through quiet recalibration. Adversaries, meanwhile, learned a different lesson. They saw that Washington's declarations outpaced its discipline. They tested boundaries, confident that narrative commitments would limit strategic flexibility. The analytical breakdown leads to a hard conclusion. The United States did not lose credibility because it acted. It lost credibility because it insisted on narrating outcomes before they existed. Intelligence was available to warn against this impulse. It was sidelined. Once that happens, recovery becomes difficult because future intelligence warnings are discounted as caution or pessimism rather than foresight. I've seen this cycle before. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, different theaters, same pathology. Intelligence that challenges the story is treated as obstruction. Intelligence that supports the story is amplified. Over time, the system forgets how to distinguish assessment from advocacy. When that line disappears, so does strategic coherence. The hard lesson is not ideological, it is professional. A state that treats intelligence as a storytelling tool will eventually lose the ability to see itself clearly. When that happens, decline does not announce itself dramatically. It arrives quietly through misread signals, missed warnings, and partners who stop taking declarations at face value. Maduro's arrest was not the end of anything. It was an opening move, one that exposed how far American strategic thinking has drifted from intelligence reality. Until that gap is closed, no operation, however tactically successful, will restore what has been lost.